I'm very excited about this evening's session. I'm just going to say a few words on kind of housekeeping before I introduce our special guest speaker. As you've now heard, we'll be recording this evening's lecture and putting it up online. We'll definitely have time for some Q&A at the end, and there'll be opportunity for both those joining us here and online to make contributions. This lecture is titled The Making of the Marx House Mural, so it's obviously very close to our hearts, and it's also very timely. Just this past year, we've invested in getting lots of kind of heritage consultants in to look at the fabric of our building, and it's become very apparent that by a very long way, our mural is our most significant historical feature. So I'm personally extremely excited to find out much more about its genesis this evening. So it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Andy Friend this evening, who's author of Revilius & Co., The Pattern of Friendship, and John Nash, The Landscape of Love and Solace, both published by Thames and Hudson. He's co-curated their accompanying touring exhibitions and is currently writing a new history of the Artists International Association.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you for the opportunity to talk here tonight, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to try and cover, obviously, the genesis of the mural upstairs, but what brought the two people who were instrumental in doing it to this building, and some of the after story and their connections. I myself came here for the first time we were trying to remember, 15, 16 months ago on one of the open days. I'm ashamed to say I've never been here before, although you obviously had seen references to the International Brigade archive here, and indeed credits to the Marx Memorial Library and the great spread of material that there is in it. And whilst I was here for my 1 hour tour, I bought this book, Andrew Rotherstein, The House on Clerkenwell Green, which those of you who know it will know it's a lot about the social and political antecedents of the space we're in and the green outside. And there's a small chapter at the end about the actual operation of Marx House from September 1933. And he mentions in it the creation of the mural by Jack Hastings in 1934. And that kind of rang a sort of bell for me, because as Marion has said, I'm writing a new history of the Artists International Association, and it didn't quite chime with some of the other information that there was elsewhere. So I came back to visit for the library in the hope that I might find some board minutes or, records of management records or whatever that would sort of nail down more precisely when it was done. And Ralph Gibson, who's not here tonight, but who was upstairs running the library that day, found for me in my inquiries about, just doing this work, doesn't seem to be moving forward. Found for me this bulletin, Marx, the number one, put out for members in November 1934, and very interesting in that it gives a very good potted history of the sort of the creation of Marx House, the All London Labour and Trades Union and Trades Council meeting that had decided that Marx House would be created, Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School, as a fitting tribute to Marx 50 years after his death, of course, and then the acquisition of a building that he knew in its SDF days, and of course, and it recounts the history of how just in September that year the operations started, after Clive and Noreen Branson had really, I think, used legacies to give a very substantial contribution to what was a wider effort of fundraising. And on that page is this thing about the Sunday lectures, which is really the beginning, the first reference to the context. It says how successful the Sunday lectures have already become. This is after a year of operation, and how there will be a need to extend the accommodation. And fortunately, we were sufficiently optimistic when we opened Marx House to anticipate a full house and provide for a partition between the lecture hall and the reading room, which can be removed if need be. And then a year later, there is another bulletin which basically says redecoration of the workers' school. Educationally, the latter half of the summer was necessarily a bit quiet. There was a summer school, but while all that was going on, the whole of Marx House has been redecorated by a group of members, some of whom supplied the material and others the work. A very fine job they've made of it. And if you've not yet been to Marx House this winter, come and see it. It's a place to be proud of. And then below it, a note about the creation of the fresco. And not only has it been redecorated, Viscount Hastings, because of his interest in Marxism, has painted a magnificent fresco covering the entire wall at the end of the lecture hall. Both he and Clifford Wight, misspelt, and I think the person, Clifford had just arrived back from America, so probably, and had been out of the country since 1915. That's why he's spelt like the colour rather than the island. He actually is the island. Clifford Wight, who was his assistant and repaired the wall for painting, had voluntarily given nearly 2 months to the job, commencing work at 7 a.m. each morning and working sometimes until nearly 11 p.m. at night. The workers' school now possesses a fine and unique work of art. So that sort of nailed down the months of its creation, those 2 months before the issue of that bulletin. So Viscount Hastings, who was to become the 16th Earl of Huntingdon, was born 8 days after Queen Victoria died in 1901. The 15th Earl, Warner Hastings, had married an Australian heiress. This was a family descended from the Plantagenets, asset rich in that they owned land in Ireland, land in England, and because of marrying Maud, now estates in Australia as well, in New South Wales at Jerilderie. And there's a lovely detail in this book written by Selina Hastings, which I should credit, and like this book, available for purchase upstairs in the library. She is the daughter of Jack Hastings by his second marriage, which we won't be talking about much tonight. But this is a cut above the normal biography written by a descendant of a semi-famous forebear. It's not full of all the sort of tedium, trivia and hagiography that one sometimes finds about biographies written by relations. It's a very interesting book, and I must credit it because I'm going to draw on some of the quite a lot of the biographical detail in that as it progresses. So, and just a quote from it, that when the future 16th Earl of Huntingdon was born, 8 days after the death of Queen Victoria, the announcement of his birth at Sharavogue, now this was the lands in Ireland, which they weren't at the time, they were actually in Grosvenor Square in London, number 10 when he was born, the announcement was postponed as a matter of decorum, because of course the Irish farm workers were going to be delighted at the appearance of a male heir. 8 days later, a lighting of bonfires, singing and dancing, tables laid with food, beer by the cartload for the tenantry, house, farm and hunt servants. So that kind of, I think, pictures them socially quite nicely. And then for the Huntingdons, there was no question that their son's future was marked out for him. A gentleman's education at Eton, which is where he was when that photograph was taken, and Oxford, marriage to an heiress, for the family was always short of money, an undemanding career in some respectable firm in the city, and of course, every spare moment to be spent either hunting, shooting, or fishing. And that indeed was the destiny he fulfilled for a while. There's his father, who basically, as far as I can detect, never did much other than be the master of the foxhounds. Jack's progress was in line with that quote, in that he went to Oxford, he got a third-class degree. He was the first year that didn't go off to the trenches, and he then went into a stockbroker's called De Zoet and something, which eventually became, after many years, part of Warburg's. His one brush with politics was in just after Easter 1916, when he'd been at the family estate in Ireland, Sharavogue, where there were 20 hunters and all the farm servants, etc. And he came back through Dublin just the week after the Easter rising, and he went to Liberty Hall and picked up some souvenirs because it had been destroyed by the English artillery. He spent a couple of years in the stockbrokers. He was clearly restless with this destiny that had been outlined for him. He decided he wanted to paint. One lunchtime, walking to his club, with a friend, he met Cristina Casati, who was Marchioness, Italian Marchioness's daughter. She was a socialite in the London scene. Jack by then had got fallen in with what his family regarded as a fast and difficult group of louche, recreational drug teaching. I mean, think Bridesheads revisited. That was the social scene he had got into. He, by this time, had his own house, 1 Manchester Square, servants, a car, tailor's bills, club bills paid by Warner. He meets Christina, and they fall in love. Almost instantly, he is restless enough to leave his job. He goes off for a few months to Italy to paint, comes back, and then to the horror of the family, but to the delight of the gossip columns, they wed. It's the announcement in the Times is great. You can just see the bottom of the announcement of the wedding above, where there are literally 200 names of people who attended the wedding. At the bottom we have Viscount Hastings and Mrs. Casati, and then from the Daily Chronicle, the Earl and Countess knew nothing about the wedding, and the news of the marriage caused astonishment in the entire household. But the detail I really liked was, with great secrecy, the wedding took place in London of Viscount Hastings, son and heir of Earl Huntingdon, and Miss Christina Casati, well known in artistic circles and a clever exponent of the tango, which was clearly the way of putting the sort of social knife in at the time. So they then elope. They go off to Melbourne. There had been a plan anyway, I think, to remove Jack from this drug-taking scene and send him off to the family properties in Australia for a bit. Those are at this place called Geraldary in southern New South Wales. They land up in Melbourne, met by the press, lots of big event in a small town. I lived in Melbourne for many years. It's now quite a big city, but then it was quite a small centre. Christina gets a job in a upmarket dress shop on Collins Street, which is the sort of Bond Street of Melbourne. Jack goes off for, I think, his last acquaintance with riding horse, to be a wrangler at Geraldary for a few months. Comes back to Melbourne, is part of he's painting by this time. He connects up with the Art Society of Victoria, particularly a painter who said, you should really get some training. He says, yes. He and Christina go off. They land up in French Polynesia in the Society Islands, an island called Maria, where, because they've got all the money, they buy this property. And they stay there in the midst of a community that has quite a lot of expats, arty people, script writers and so on, particularly one guy called Govey Morris from California. She falls pregnant. They decide to come back. And then there is the reverse gossip column thing, which unfortunately I haven't got, which is the Duke and the Earl and his wife were delighted at the son coming back, and there's a sort of the family getting back together. While he's back here, he takes up that advice to get some training, and he goes to the Slade for a number of terms at the same time as Clive Branson is there as a student. And this is an important connection for the future. This thing is not working.
It's not working.
Sorry. So Clive Branson on the left, a self-portrait, portrait of an unemployed man. Apologies for the quality of these images.
You're just going to do, is it? Yeah.
Here's another photo. We were looking for a photograph of Clive around that time. If anybody knows of any, it would be great to get hold of them. But this is actually taken a few years later, when he's just joined. He's actually fought in Spain by this time. He's just joined the Royal Armoured Corps. This is 1940. He dies as a tank commander 3 years later. And there are photographs of him taken 3 years later. And my God, I think I said to you in an email, it's astounding how he had aged in those 3 years. What is this not working? So anyway, so William Coldstream, an artist, later Sir William Coldstream, part of the realist school, the Euston Road School, wrote this in 1937, looking back at that time when they were together at the Slade. How the slump affected us all very considerably through the immense change in our general outlook. One painter I knew lost all his money and had to become a traveller in vacuum cleaners. Everyone began to be interested in economics, then in politics. Two very talented painters who had been at the Slade with me gave up painting altogether, one to work for the ILP and the other for the Communist Party. That was Clive Branson. I became convinced that art ought to be directed to a wider public, whereas all the ideas which I had learned to regard as artistically revolutionary ran in the opposite direction. And I think that was among that group that was at the Slade, there was that instinct. Felicia Brown was another of that group. So after the Slade, they go back to the South Pacific. They sell that property we saw before, Maria, and they leave in 1930, July, I think it was. I'm looking at my notes, but it was around then. And they land up going to San Francisco through the people that they've known there. And Jack is promised an exhibition in San Francisco through these connections, which takes place. About 30 of his paintings, I don't think any of them are extant anymore, but things that he'd done in the South Pacific. And he's looking at the paper, and there's a notice about his show, but beneath it is a review of a Diego Rivera exhibition that had just opened in the town. And he goes to it, and he's bowled over. And it was a bit about that, what we've just heard from Coldstream. This is an art that looked very vibrant, very innovative, but communicative. And so here, and this is from an unpublished manuscript, now unfortunately in the Harry Ransom Center in America. So I haven't actually been able to see it, but it's quoted in Selena's book. Here at last was a painter who had been through all the phases, academic, post-impressionist, cubist, and now had emerged from the laboratory with the power of expressing himself and the world about him in such a way as could appeal to all classes and kinds of people. And then he wrote another article about the experience of going to the exhibition. It seemed that he had solved, this is Rivera, it seemed that he had solved the problem, as only the greatest painters have succeeded in doing, of representing understandably and truthfully the outside world, and at the same time creating a source of aesthetic pleasure in the pure form, colour and line of the design. So he had this reaction to the exhibition. There was a sculptor there called Ralph Stackpole, who through these connections of Gobi Morris and so on, he was able to get to Ralph Stackpole, and he engineered a meeting with Rivera. So he goes on the 15th of November 1930 to Stackpole's studio. Frida Kahlo is there, and Rivera is working on the drawings which lead to this commission, which was in the San Francisco Stock Exchange. And it was on the staircase going up to the lunchroom, and he was just about to start working on this. Big central figure, think of the one upstairs, of Khalifa, representing California, the abundance of California. The mining represented the gold panning, the agriculture, the science and innovation. Ralph Stackpole's son appears holding a model aeroplane, and the docks and so on behind, the waterfront behind. So this was the design he was working on. Hastings says, "Will you take me on as an apprentice?" Rivera looks at him and said, "Yes, you can start tomorrow." So he starts tomorrow. They're just going on site. Quite a big team do frescoes, because the way frescoes work are wet plaster, watercolor. The watercolor dries as the plaster dries and becomes very resilient. So this is different from murals painted with oil and wax, and then varnished or otherwise protected. So quite a substantial team tends to work on preparing the wall, preparing the plaster, pricking out the design onto the plaster, and then having to work rapidly while before it completely dries out. And the foreman of on the site is Clifford Wight. Clifford Wight, almost exactly the same age, born a year later than Jack. Completely, literally the other side of the tracks. His father was a railway fitter in Swindon. Family migrated to Montreal in, I think, about 1914. Clifford, who would have been 14 in 1915, followed on a little bit later. Whether he'd been finishing an apprenticeship or something is very unclear. The biographical information about Clifford is slight. He lands up being in Canada, stays in Canada, he's in the Royal Mounted Police for a bit. Anyway, by the mid-20s, he's in San Francisco training as an architect, and he then goes off to Mexico, hooks up with Diego Rivera, and becomes an apprentice there, and has worked with Rivera. He may actually have gone to Moscow with Rivera in 1927-8 for the 10th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Anyway, they work on this image in San Francisco Stock Exchange. We can move on to the next one. And there, this is from Selina Hastings' book. The photograph on the left is actually credited as being them working on this second mural, which is the next one that Rivera was commissioned to do, which is at the School of Fine Art. And it's called The Making of a Fresco. And so they are doing this is an illusion they're trying to create of them creating the fresco. And this photograph is actually not, although in Selina's Hastings book it said it's at the Stock Exchange, but at the Fine Art School. It's actually at the Stock Exchange, because we won't flick back, but that, what you can see there, the hand there, and that is part of the previous image. But similar sort of thing, when this statue was unveiled, the people who commissioned it were very unhappy that their superstar artist had basically pictured himself arse towards them on the scaffold. And at the top is actually Clifford Wight on the right-hand side and Jack Hastings holding a plumb line. And they are working on the top of this big figure of the central worker. The other thing that happened when this was unveiled was, and I think it's been painted out after this, before this image was taken, was that on the breast pocket of the jacket of the worker was a large red communist star and a yellow hammer and sickle. And this was taken to be provocative. When so this is done. Jack and Christina are there living in San Francisco. They become very friendly with Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Moving on to the next one, if we may. And the next one, sorry, that was just the detail of that. Yes, that's then in that's Frida Kahlo and Christina and another woman, and this is Christina in the South Pacific. There's a nice anecdote in Selena's book that Frida Kahlo, Christina, what do they call him? The gargantuan Mexicano Diego Rivera and Jack Hastings were on a ferry in the Bay Area, and this guy was looking at them intently, and then eventually came across and said, "Say, what circus are you with?" Because they look such an odd quartet. So if we could move on to the next one. So at this point, enter William Valentina, who's on the right. He had been the director of the Metropolitan Museum, not the MoMA, but the Metropolitan Museum in New York, German academic art historian. He was now the director of the Detroit Institute of Fine Art, and he'd come to California because he had a passionate obsession with a tennis player called Helen Wills, who was apparently very beautiful, and he was in pursuit of her, got into this social circle, met Diego Rivera, and started talking about Rivera coming to Detroit to do a whole series of murals in the Fine Art Institute, of which he was the director, if we could move on. So this commission eventually comes through. It's going to be bankrolled by Edsel Ford, Henry's son, I think. In 1932, March 1932, Christina and Jack leave by car to drive to Detroit because Clifford Wight and Jack are the two employees out of the creative team that has done these murals in San Francisco who are rehired. And as Jack Hastings said later, I left California a socialist, and I arrived a communist. His words to that effect. It's not a totally accurate quote, but he said that later, and it's been observed. And what happened was, think the grapes of wrath here, they were doing the reverse journey. So they drove through the center. They went Arizona, Oklahoma, across the Great Plains, Kansas, up to Missouri, up to Michigan. So that great flow of people off the land during the Dust Bowl era and out of the depressed urban centers was what they were crossing, and they observed this. And also Alec Waugh, Evelyn Waugh's brother, who was a great friend of Hastings, they went to Moscow together in 1935, just before the mural upstairs was done, wrote that at the time he had started reading socialist literature, in particular John Strachey's The Coming Struggle for Power, which was published in 1932. Strachey, of course, somebody involved with the Left Book Club. So they go across, and if we can move on there, and they arrive, across that experience, they arrive in Detroit. So the next one, where, and we can flip quite quickly through the next few slides, where this extraordinary set of murals, which was based on the Baton Rouge, Michigan plant, then the largest industrial enterprise in the capitalist world, employed 100,000 before the crash. By this time, because of the crash, actually output was down to a fifth of what it had been 2 years before. But in the Institute, I mean, they spent a lot of time going around the plant. They did this extraordinary sort of industrial, and there were quite a few other murals that they did within this complex. No, just back to the other one. One of which caused another scandal because it was like a nativity scene, but it was a doctor vaccinating a child being held by its mother. And it was deliberately about social progress, but it really got the goat of the religious conservative. And so that became another scandal. We'd already had the star in the art school, now we had this. And but more was to come. So this is done. Jack then gets a separate commission, his first own commission, at the Chicago World Fair, which was due to open in 1933. He goes to Chicago. He's applied for it at Rivera's suggestion. He gets a gig to do murals about dentistry in the Hall of Science. Before he gets there, he calls in on an old Oxford friend and lands up doing a mural about bootlegging. So this is we're talking prohibition time here. Bootlegging, the history of bootlegging in the refreshment room of this old friend's quite palatial house, which he does, and I think a photograph still exists of that. He then moves on and does this thing about dentistry. Different technique because the building was still being built. So there was another Mexican muralist called Siqueiros, and he had perfected a technique of using spray guns on aluminium panels to do murals. And that was what Jack Hastings did in this instance. So he does that. Meanwhile, Rivera and crew and Clifford Wight have gone down to New York to do, in the next one, to do Man at the Crossroads in the Rockefeller Center. Rockefeller Center, largest construction site in the Western world at that time. So, we leave aside the Moscow Metro. But in the Western world, the largest construction site, very big prominent project. There was a scandal in New York that a foreign artist had been picked to do the major mural in the lobby. But Nelson Rockefeller, the first Nelson Rockefeller, had hired Rivera to do it, and he came up with this thing called Man at the Crossroads. It was meant to be a contrast between science and progress and the alternatives. If we could go on to the next one, the fact that it had been a scandal that Rivera had been appointed led the trustees of MoMA, the Modern Art Museum in New York, which had just been founded in 1925, moved into new premises that year, to put on a show called Murals by American painters and photographers. And I think there were 35 painters and 14 photographers who did mural designs which went up at this exhibition. And this caused a major scandal. And it was intended to draw the sting out of the controversy about the appointment of Rivera to do the Rockefeller Center. But actually, so these three in particular attracted the wrath of the establishment. So the one on the left is called is by Hugo Gellert, and it's called Us fellows have got to stick together. And that was a phrase that Al Capone used when he was interviewed by a member, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a journalist from the Vanderbilt family. And he said, us fellows have got to stick together. So that's what this is called. And you can see President Hoover, top left, Al Capone, Rockefeller, etc., protected by this sort of, sheriff, policeman, state troopers, vigilante, and Tom Mooney, the imprisoned trade union leader, at the bottom. The next one along, William Groper, is called The Writing on the Wall, has Andrew Mellon and J.P. Morgan as the figures in the top. They were figures who had basically monopolised the trade in armament munitions supply during the First World War to Europe and become very rich on the back of it. And then Ben Shahn, The Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti. Jefferson in the background, the Supreme Court judges who had turned down the appeal, and the corpses of Sacco and Vanzetti. So these artists in this exhibition at MoMA had managed to piss off every major family in the New York financial establishment. So this was an enormous scandal. Meanwhile, Rivera down the road is doing a short Man at the Crossroads. This is a surviving photograph taken by a woman called Lucienne Bloch, who was on the team. Rivera realized that there was a danger his work was going to be destroyed, and so asked her to take photographs of them. And they're the only, of the original work, the only things we now have, because a sort of Tory equivalent rag paper called the World Telegram in April 1933 published the fact that Rivera was putting into this design a portrait of Lenin and a May Day parade. And this became, think Braverman saying something, this became like that instantly. Rockefeller panicked, and in May 33, he ordered it all to be sent all the artists off the site, Rivera included, and had it plastered over. Rivera got $7,000 for his trouble. And here there is a connection to Marx House, I think, because he spent that on doing a series of works at the workers' school, the new workers' school, on 1932, had moved into a rented loft premises or warehouse premises on East 12th Street. And he did this thing called Portrait of America. Jack and Christina had by now finished in Chicago and came down to New York as all in the aftermath of all this trouble, while Rivera was working on this mural in the workers' school at East whatever it was Street. Frida Kahlo and Rivera says, "You're leaving the country. Before you go back to Britain, why don't you go to our house in Mexico?" So they go down to Mexico in August 33. And spend the summer, and they are there until summer 1934. Kahlo and Rivera actually come back to Mexico, and Rivera then paints this, which is his recreation in Mexico City of what had been destroyed in New York. And you can see here Lenin and the May Day parade that was so contentious in the New York version recreated. So Rivera has this track record. He loves to get. He's a superstar. He gets the patronage, but he always wants to put something in that says his politics and tweaks the tale of the people who've commissioned him. Moving on to the next one. So by this time, Jack and Christina are in Mexico City. They're about to come back they arrive here in summer 1934. Clifford Wight, who's been working with Rivera on the two things in New York, actually goes back to the West Coast. And so this was the point at which the New Deal was coming in. There was when Roosevelt got elected, there were emergency employment things to get people through the winter of 33-34, which included the creation of a scheme that employed about 5,000, gave about 4 or 5 months' work to about 5,000 artists nationwide. That was then replaced by a far bigger scheme that led in total to the creation of 4,000 murals, 1,300 of them in post offices throughout the land, many of which became contentious because the artists took up things like lynching, labour controls, etc., and fascism as well, as that began to creep into the picture. Clifford Wight goes back to the West Coast, and there's this art building called the Coit Tower, which has been built, and this is where I needed my point. The Coit Tower is sort of top right up here near the waterfront, and it was a memorial to a woman who was a sort of philanthropist around town who died, and just as White gets back there, this is taken into the federal program. 26 artists are commissioned to create frescoes in the tower. And while this is going on, just literally a quarter of a mile away on the waterfront is the very protracted, violent, but well-known dispute between the longshoremen on the one hand, the AFL, Conservative Trade Union Federation, and the employers on the other, which led to a general strike. It led to the deployment of state troopers. Whilst Clifford Wight was working in that building, 4 people were shot dead in the confrontation on the waterfront. So if we could move on to the next slide. He does 4 figures. He gets allocated an area where there are 3 big windows, hence 4 panels, 2 on either side, 2 in the middle. And he does 4 figures of a cowboy, a farmer, and if you go on to the next one, a surveyor and a construction worker, and then on to the next one. And he can't resist doing exactly what Diego had done. This in turn becomes a scandal. Over the central window, and this is a press report, White stretched a bridge, at the centre of which is a circle containing the blue eagle of the NRA, the National Recovery Act, so the New Deal. That was the funding of the New Deal. Over the right-hand window, he stretched a segment of chain. In the circle appears the legend "In God We Trust," symbolising the American dollar or capitalism. Over the left-hand window, he placed a section of woven cable and a circle framing a hammer, a sickle, and the legend "United Workers of the World," in short, communism. And I'm sure by now you can guess what happened. There was an absolute eruption. The authorities refused to open the building. The artists went on strike. The building had been due to open in May. It still wasn't open 2 or 3 months later. The artist strike eventually broke down. 16 of the 26 wrote to the commissioners and said, "We are loyal, we give in," effectively. And Clifford Wight was no longer involved, and these linking things across the windows were painted out. He also very shortly afterwards learnt that his visa would not be renewed, and then he came back, and he comes back, and by now Jack Hastings is back living in Regent's Park Road with Christina, and on the way back Clifford Wight and his wife give their address as the address they're going to. So the 2 of them are united in London, and they both join the Artists International Association. And back to that bulletin, the first one, there is a page in it which talks about the Artists International exhibition. This was the AIA, the Artists International was formed in October 1933. They had their first exhibition a year later in a disused motorbike showroom in Charlotte Street. It attracted quite an interesting array of artists. Henry Moore was involved, Paul Nash was involved, Eric Gill was involved, and Hastings, I think, had just got back and may have had something in it. And it's quite interesting from the point of view of what was going on around the left and art here, this description. All the artists contributing to this exhibition had a common objective, each of them with his particular abilities about shows the social problem of today. It is interesting to note that most of the work showed a preference for subjects of underlined masses in action. The exhibition of posters were extraordinarily expressive and impressive. One will never forget the 3 posters exposing the savage heads of European fascism, literally armed to the teeth. That was done by James Boswell, one of the Left Review cartoonists. Another particular feature was the remarkable photographs taken by Miss Tudor Hart, which proved that there can be revolutionary photography. And if we move on to the next one, this was the genesis of that exhibition, which was something coming from Moscow. The Secretariat of the International Bureau of Revolutionary Artists in Moscow has sent an invitation. The exhibition is going to go around all the republics. Subjects suggested: working class subjects of all kinds, strikes, elections, struggles between workers and reactionary forces, workers must be shown definitely opposing their enemies, unemployed scenes, etc., etc. The one I really like is landscape, showing the life of the agricultural proletariat. So none of your normal conventional stuff. So this led to the exhibition being put together, and indeed a whole lot of work went off to Moscow after the exhibition. If we move on to the next one, the photograph referred to in the Marx House Bulletin of Edith Tudor Hart, one of the ones is this. It's called Sedition. This is the time that there was an attempt to introduce the new Incitement to Disaffection Act, which would have criminalised the mere possession of literature which, if placed in the hands of a member of the armed forces, might lead them to question orders. Think how broad that is. Anyway, so this was, I think, taken at a Trafalgar Square meeting called by NCCL, as was now Liberty, and it is a fantastic photo, because if you just, what it is the special branch recording what is going on at the meeting. And she's taken it, Edith Tudor Hart, just at the moment that the guy on the right realizes he's being photographed, and the woman in the crowd behind. And so then their colleague is writing it down, and this superb sort of disdain and of the other one. If you move on, this was instantly satirized in Left Review by Boswell, who did his own take on it. And this was the time, so Marx House has been open a year, Left Review has started, the Artist International is getting going. There were three Jameses, James Boswell, who did this, and if we could go on, the next one, this was called Incitement to Disaffection, harks back to when Churchill was supporting the legislation. But what a beautifully drawn piece of satirical imagery that is. And then on to the next one. This was with a quote from Kipling's poem Recessional at the top. The tumult and the shouting dies, the captain and the kings depart. This is about the aftermath of the Jubilee celebrations in 1935. So we've got, I think, a Poplar Borough Council dust cart collecting all the crap that is left over from this royalist celebration. So on to the next one. And then there was also James Holland was the third one. There's another piece of art. This is called The Sailor's Return. Small lithographed image in Left Review, but incredibly evocative of feeling in a way. This merchant scene and the coming back to his house, and the sense of both relaxation and sadness in the way that figure is put together. And then James Fitton, who was the last of the three Jameses, who did this thing called For Charity. So philanthropy hasn't really changed. I mean, you could find this in, the Grosvenor Hotel many winter nights. A superb satire. I see there's something from to Comrade Tom Mann up there. So successful were these cartoons in putting Left Review on the map that they produced in 1936 Desk Diary. Which was composed of the three Jameses cartoons. And a member of the Holland family recently gave me to put into something which a display about the AI that's going to be at the Tate next year, a desk diary which was autographed by Tom Mann, which was rather nice. So it was obviously, he was there at the launch. Anyway, moving on. So James Fitton. One of the things about research in the AIA is the superb service that MI6 and the special branch did by opening everybody's post and taking out Home Office warrants. James Fitton, Mancunian father, blacklisted, had to go to night shifts in Preston from Manchester because he couldn't get any employment. Eventually becomes national officer for the AEU, comes down, they live in Peckham. James himself, had real hearing problems, thrown out of school with, this kid will never do anything, but he can draw a bit, goes off, has a couple of drawing office jobs, goes to Manchester Art School, evening classes, becomes best mates with L.S. Lowry. They spend loads of time together, even though Lowry is 10 years older. Comes down to London when his family have moved down here and begins to work through agencies. Goes to Arcos, which was the all-Russian cooperative society, subject of a famous special branch raid. He's sent by studio to Arcos because part of in the trade deal that was done between the Soviet Union and the UK, the first recognition of the Russian state, basically was a deal to import timber and oil and to export engineering products and so on. Arcos was central to that. They had quite a network of their own proprietary filling stations. By the end of the 20s, Russian oil products stood for Soviet petrol. He did this poster, which in an unpublished memoir, he says, I did this poster, which was a bit like Leger and Kandinsky, and it was of a racehorse. And about 4 months ago, in a loft in Camberwell of a relative, I found it. So I was very, very pleased because nobody had, I think, seen it in modern times. That's the poster. James is there on the right with his wife Margaret, who had been at the Slade, was a member of the AIA. If we move on again, Pearl Binder, another later Lady Elwyn Jones, but another Mancunian Jewish family, went to Manchester Art School, had been a member, came down to London, extraordinary good illustrator, had a brief marriage to a much older man who's an anthropologist at the LSE, split up with him, went to Whitechapel, did superb lithographs about Whitechapel. She went 3 times to the Soviet Union. The first of which in 1933 she went, and when she meets there an artist, a man called Clifford Wight, an artist who was over there for 18 months. And comes back, and she goes to the Central School of Art, where James Fitton has now taken on the lithography class. And that lithography class met 3 times a week, became a sort of political discussion club, quite frankly. It was also where quite a lot of early emigre artists went to, because it was run by the LCC, and unlike the Royal College of Art or the Royal Academy, you could get cheap or free art facilities there. Anyway, this is taken by Edith Tudor Hart, that photograph of Pearl Binder. These are lithographs by Pearl Binder, one called The Bell Foundry, done about the East End of the Whitechapel, superb book called Odd Jobs. This one, Russian Train Journey, which relates to one of her 3 times in there. When she comes back in 1933, she goes to the evening class and she says, Clifford is coming back from Moscow. He's going to be at Misha Black's flat. Misha Black lived in Little Earl Street, as it was called in Covent Garden. We should go down there. And that was the meeting in autumn 1933 in September, which had the idea of founding the Artists International in London. We'll move on, which Jack joined. Here's Misha Black on the left. Misha and Clifford had done a pamphlet for the party, Communist Party, called The Spirit of Invergordon, before he went. Clifford goes off to Moscow. He's actually eloping with going for a new life with an older married woman doctor from Wandsworth. Needless to say, it didn't work out. But anyway, he's there on a 7-day trip from SCR trip. He walks into the foreign publishing house there and looks up and says, I did that. And they said, you did that, you're hired. And so he works there for 18 months, if we move on. And he does these various pamphlets, which are for the foreign publishing house, and move on again. And then he gets called in October of that year to a meeting by the people who are organising the 15th anniversary exhibition for the Foundation of the Red Army. This is a detail of the painting he did. It is a massive mural, very colourful mural. It is about the hunger marchers being attacked by the police in Trafalgar Square in 1932. And what happened was they said at that meeting, we want you to do something about the class struggle in your country. And all he had was copies of the Daily Worker. If you read the Daily Workers and look at I've shown a minute detail here for a reason I'll go into. You look at the copies of the Daily Worker, he's accumulated the incidents. This actually, the railings thing took place in Hyde Park, that took place over 10 tumultuous days when the 1932 hunger strike arrived in London. Trenchard, who'd been appointed Commissioner of Metropolitan Police by MacDonald, a real choice character, Trenchard. Actually, his previous experience was colonialism. He'd fought in the Boer War. He was an early advocate of using aerial bombing to control restless natives, which they did in Nigeria. So the technique perfected by Mussolini and the Italians in Abyssinia was actually trialled by him. And he, in the early 20s, he advocated to Churchill when he was Home Secretary that the RAF, after the First World War, should be used against strikers in England. Churchill wrote back to him and said, never tell me this, make this suggestion to me again, which is quite extraordinary. Anyway, he was in charge. They attacked the hunger marchers. There were running battles over 10 days in Hyde Park, in Trafalgar Square. A 1 million person petition was confiscated before it could be presented to Parliament at Charing Cross Station. That same night, there was an attempt to plant material on Royal Hannington. There was a raid the next day, and he was taken in with two others to keep him away from being able to organise. Anyway, Cliff does this big mural. And I think I've just about got time to say, which disappeared entirely from sight, has recently been discovered in the National Gallery of Ukraine in Lviv, and is now not in the National Gallery. It's outside in hiding, like our art during the Second World War. And they sent me very kindly, it's only the 5th invoice they've issued this year, a high-res image of it. And we're working on a project to get the mural back. Why it is so seminal and important as an artwork is that the experience that he had there, he was working in this big studio with all these other foreign artists in Moscow, including artists from China and Japan. At the time, Japan was invading Manchuria, that very bloody excursion of the Imperial Army into Manchuria in 1932. And he was absolutely struck by the ability of artists to work across national hatreds in solidarity. So he writes back to Misha Black. Fortunately, Misha had also done a poster for Russian oil products, so his post was being owned by the special branch, and they copy this letter and put it in another file to do with Inver Gordon. The MI6 still deny that they were opening either of these people's posts, but because it was put in another file, we know they were. Anyway, so that was the foundation story of the AIA, which Jack joins. There is a sort of visual connection to Diego Rivera. The Rivera had been there in 27, 28. And he connected up with a group of mainly Ukrainian modernists called the Bolshevikists. There is an exhibition coming next summer to the Royal Academy, which is well worth seeing. It's called In the Eye of the Storm. It's Ukrainian art between 1900 and the 30s, experimental modernist art. Most of these guys and girls got wiped out actually in the terror in the late 30s. This artwork, which has been brought out of Ukraine since the Russian invasion, has been in Madrid, in Berlin, Brussels, and is coming to the Royal Academy. This is in it, I think. My pronunciation will betray me. It's from a triptych about a soaring operation. This is called the Sawyers. There's another one called Rolling the Logs, and one called Sharpening the Saws, by a guy called Alexander Bohomazov. who actually died in, I think, 1930. But this very monumental painting, very bright colours. And if we flip back, just carry on. I think there was Cliff Rowe was picking up a bit on that, and there's a sort of vein of Rivera's composition that comes through. So we go forward again. Okay. So Cliff Rowe comes back. First thing the AIA do is there's another hunger march in 34. That for those of you who are of a generation where we used to Gestetner leaflets as part of student politics, this was the hunger march. Why we are marching was 12 artists, quite a few of them from the Hogarth group of the CP, who put together a book of cartoons to sell as the Hunger Marches in 1934 arrived. This one, I've just put one of them up. It's by a guy called Ralph Lauries, who was a member of the Hogarth group. It's a superb cartoon in terms of the situation as it existed in 1934. So you've got MacDonald sitting with Baldwin, the national government. Baldwin about to take over. He's got his hand on the levers of power, controlling the mandarins in Whitehall. The new unemployment bill going through Parliament, which mandates the fact that cuts must be imposed in benefits by local authorities. The benefits are lopped off and it goes into the armament bin. It's a fascist scheme. Up the top, Hitler and Mussolini, with Mosley in the middle for future enlargement. A sort of perfect political cartoon. There's some great stuff in it, not all of that quality if we move on. Cliff Rowe is doing other design for the AIA. So Cambridge Anti-War Exhibition, this one I think done with scraper board for the CP forward to the National Congress. This Hunger March was coming to a National Congress that was held in Bermondsey Town Hall, if we go on. And then he does this poster. We are going to get back to Jack Hastings in a minute, which was put up throughout London during the Jubilee. Trenchard had a lot of them ripped down. Very few survive. This one is actually in a museum overseas, but it was crucial because on it they were naive enough to put printed and published by the Artists International at Arundel Gardens, London, W11. If we move on, that was Betty Reed lived there, who had become the secretary of the Artists International, knew Jack Hastings well. And her father was a Harley Street specialist and Trenchard was a friend. And Trenchard went to the father, said, look what your daughter's doing. The father never talked to her again. I think talked to her again once in his life, cut her off, rich family. She was getting separating from a barrister she'd been married to. She'd been at the Royal College of Art and Movie. She becomes secretary of the Royal College of the Artists International. And she's quite frankly a brilliant strategist. Because in 35, if we move on, she begins to develop this coalition and this use of, this is a group of students. They haven't got a bean between them. They are creatives trying to survive in an art market that's gone fuck. They reach upwards and outwards to the much better established artists and convince them to come on board in a very early iteration of a Popular Front organisation. Eric Gill, Duncan Grant, Augustus John, Laura Knight, Henry Moore, Paul Nash, and the Artists International. We're going to have an exhibition against fascism and war if we move on. And it took place, by which time they become the Artists International Association and these people. So no longer the Artists International, it's the association. They've declared themselves as an attempt at Popular Front. They do get a lot of foreign artists involved, exhibiting in Soho Square. So Kowalska, Zadkin, which is Zadkin, Leholt, Mazaril, etc., Tismaya, and Poland, Holland, USSR. Interesting on the back cover, a snapshot of the sort of ecology that was around Marx House at the time. Hallett West, Marxism and Aesthetics, John Strachey, The Crisis in Culture, people who lectured in this building, quite a lot of the schools.
Of course, a party and a dance and a fundraiser. The Cambridge Anti-Fascist exhibition next door to this exhibition in Soho Square. Publication of 5 on revolutionary art. Very important, slim volume that brought together Klingenda, A.L. Lloyd and Alec West. Marxist, the beginnings of Marxist interpretation. Herbert Reed, anarchist and all over the place, and Eric Gill, sort of Catholic communalism, and then the left theatre. So this conjunction of the artist, the theatre, the intellectual current emerging, evidenced in the catalogue. If we move on. This was the exhibition this was the iteration of the Cambridge Anti-Fascist exhibition, which had been to 40 venues around the country, trade union branches, co-ops, etc. This is actually done by Monk Knight Kauffer, the Canadian living in London. And Lord Hastings, ... So this exhibition was being put together just as the mural upstairs was being done. There is one suggestion in an academic paper that ... was a painting he did in Mexico. I think more likely, and I will try and track down the evidence, is before we have the display at the tape, is that it was actually the cartoon, the design for upstairs, which was put on display in this exhibition. And so if we move on, and just go back a moment, but look at the artists that they were attracting. Lucien Pizarro, so, out of the end of the last century, Stephen Bone, young sort of Muirhead Bone's son, Percy Horton, very important player in the AIA and around this scene, James Holland, Dame Laura Knight, Dawn, I don't know, but he knows that painting. It's the very famous one of a young woman in sunlight. Cedric Morris, Essex Bakehouse, so just emerging as an artist, so young artists as well. So they were attracting, I think there were probably 150 to 200 artists involved in this exhibition, but attracting. So just before the mural was created upstairs, Alec Waugh and Jack Hastings went off to Moscow. They went on a trip. And they went there at a time when the cult of personality was in a sense, around Stalin, was in a sense at its most unalloyed. Success of the 5-year plan, non-recovery of much of the Western economy, credible case that the Soviet Union was forging ahead, moving itself up several notches, Moscow Metro being created. So they're there. They are not actually, they pick up on slight unease, the people they're talking to there, about what is going on, particularly the move towards a much more controlled artistic scene. This is the social realism enunciated at the Congress the year before, moving towards the engineer of human souls notion that, the party will mandate or the authorities will mandate and the artist will deliver according to chosen themes, cutting out individual experimentation. They pick up a bit on that. Anyway, moving on, if we can. Thank you. So now let's look at this design, which he does immediately on coming back from Moscow. What do we have? We have on the left, we have obviously very well rooted to this spot in the sense that, Lenin, 22 editions of Iskra edited and printed in this building. Marx knew this building. Next to him, William Morris, and cooperative movement on the extreme left. Robert Owen, thank you very much. Senior moment there. And then Lenin and Engels. So very much the antecedents of a specifically English experience. One could read that as, and on the left-hand side, Chartism, a Welsh miner Interestingly, Pearl Binder and Edith Tudor Hart had been down Edith Tudor Hart photographing Welsh miners during the summer, and I suspect that there may be a photo of Edith's that underpins that figure. He specifically said it was modelled on a Welsh miner. So there, this big central figure, a bit like Khalifa and other things in the Diego canon, overthrowing the capitalist chaos of the present. But on the right-hand side, a clear representation of the international movement in terms of all the different areas of colonialism represented with specific figures. Who's missing? Stalin. And this is a very deliberate, I think, exclusion, because the fact that it is is not just the English scene, it's not just the people linked to Clerkenwell Green, but has that international reference to the international movement. I think it is a striking omission from a design done by Hastings at that particular point in time. So if we move on, sorry, I'm just fighting on. So the fresco at Marx house, should I be winding up the room? Do people want? There's probably about another 10
We're enjoying it.
Oh, okay. So in that bulletin, we won't go through it and done, but is a claim that it's pretty unique, which it is, because fresco had not been done significantly in Britain at all. Viscount Hastings has worked in America. There is an argument about that.
What
this
year was this?
So this was November 1935 when this page was written. So the building has been refurbished during the summer by voluntary effort. I think Jack and Christina had financially contributed to that, apart from him working upstairs. So he and Clifford have been working upstairs, and then there is his description of the subject of the picture and the symbolic representation we've just been through. So that's there. And this is his description in the Daily Mirror. There was a press article, it was Welsh miner, the worker of the future. On the left, I've tried to propagate, and on the other side, I show the present day labour movement. But it is the present day labour movement in certainly an international, or certainly an incarnation that represents British colonialism, and I would argue is sufficiently broad that it represents the sort of the broader Comintern world. So if we move on. So why was it unique at that time? And the reason was that really murals, which there's a contradiction about murals, that they're meant to be permanent, and they're actually quite ephemeral because they're immovable. Buildings change, buildings get destroyed, things deteriorate. But there were quite a few murals being done, but not in the public domain. So this is the Bloomsbury School of Interior Decoration. This is a music room by Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell at a demonstration one at the gallery. If we move on, there were murals done at Morley College, but so Borden and Revilius did murals at Morley College, destroyed in the Blitz in 1940, but which were very well known, and they had followed on from Rex Whistler's sort of fantasy landscapes in the restaurant at Tate Britain. And this was about theatre, and there were things like Alfred and the Danes, done by an artist whose name temporarily escapes me, in St Stephen's Hall at Westminster. So they didn't tend to be either political or public, public in quite the same way. So there was uniqueness there. Jack Hastings may have hoped that it would trigger, the mural here would trigger, and certain people in the AIA were arguing that murals and lithographs and graphic art, rather than easel art, which was the province of the galleries and the private possessions, that easily produced and circulated cheap art for everybody in the form of prints, or murals in the form of things that have a public presence, were desirable media for socially engaged artists. Jack Hastings did move on to do other murals. He did one in a restaurant near Piccadilly. He did one
in D.N. Pritt's house when Pearl Binder came back from another trip to Russia in the spring of 1936, just before the Spanish Civil War. And he did one, which I'll mention right at the end, at Buscott House, Gavin Farringdon, who was one of his sort of racy friends from the 20s, but who also went to the socialist route. He had his Rolls Royce converted into an ambulance for the Spanish Civil War, chartered his own ship in Marseille on the collapse of the Spanish Republic to get people out of Catalonia. Jack Hastings became more and more involved with the AIA, so he opened and backed the Felicia Brown exhibition. So Felicia Brown, I'm sure many of you know, first known British volunteer to be killed in the Spanish Civil War. Killed, it says here, on August the 29th. I think it was the 22nd, in fact. But she'd gone to Barcelona because the Workers' Alternative Olympics to the Berlin Olympics was due to be staged just as the military rising took place, Franco's military rising. She'd gone with Edith Bone. She landed up going to the front. She went to rescue an Italian comrade who'd been they were trying to plant explosives along a railway line. They did that, but on the way back were ambushed. She actually had to be left there with the Italian comrade, but her notebook, sketchbooks were grabbed, came back, via Harry Pollitt, reached her great friend Elizabeth Watson, and the AIA put on this exhibition, which was the first fundraiser really for Spanish medical aid in October, the first large fund. She was wonderful sketches she had actually done just in the brief couple of weeks she was in the militia. Hastings was involved in this exhibition. If we move on, these are some of the sketches. He went twice to Spain. He went with two Labour MPs and Sonia Brown very early on, brought back some of the earliest evidence of German and Italian involvement within weeks of the war breaking out. He did this mural, which was a portable mural on an aluminium panel, so like the thing he'd done in Chicago, which was in an exhibition. It was used on the front of a news sheet. We move on. He went again at the time when the Republic's care for art had become a highly contentious issue. The nationalists were saying church burnings, destruction of private property, these people are destroying, the heritage of Spain. The national government, siege of Madrid, had to organise they'd made Picasso the honorary director of the Prado. A mate of Picasso is actually one of the people who's persuaded him to do Guernica at the Spanish Pavilion at the 1937 fair in Paris, organised the evacuation of all the Prado pictures, including all Goya's, the disasters of war and so on, to Valencia. Hastings went back and made an inspection. That article was about how art was being taken care of, and he became very vocal part of the argument defending the Republic here. I won't go through it all. If we could go on to the next one. The difference between the American scene, which he had come from, and which I think he wanted to emulate in terms of the murals, and here was that what I referred to earlier, that vast demand generated by federal spending for artists. I mean, 5,000 artists involved in New York on a combination of graphic work, murals, other projects at one time. This went on, it was challenged by the Republicans. It was coming under great pressure by 38, 39. But the Artists' Union was a major part of, was able to organise out of the John Reed clubs, out of the CP network, was able to organise artists in a way because there was an industrial basis for doing it. There was a mass employer of artists. They were in workplaces together. The Artists' Union led on to the calling of an artist congress in New York in early 1936, if we move on. And that was written about in Left Review by Percy Horton, who I mentioned, under the name Toros. He was working at the Royal College of Art at the time, and I had to adopt a pseudonym for his political activity. And the first artist congress, which Hastings it was due to be held in this enormous building in 41 Grosvenor Square. Hastings basically arranged the rental of it. He'd been born at number 10, so it was quite ironically arranged in Grosvenor Square. And they called this Artist Congress, which was accompanied by this massive exhibition of 1,000 works. And the Artist Congress, though, was very directed towards what was the industrial position of artists, as well as the issue of anti-fascism. Enormous amount of preparation for it, which Jack Hastings was intimately involved in with other people in this building. But he, a woman called Nan Youngman, Quentin Bell, Vanessa Bell's son and so on, formed the Education Commission. It was an extraordinary Congress. There were about 50 recommendations that went before it, prefiguring much of post-war arts policy in terms of the role of local authorities, the role of an arts council, how to reform art education, etc. And an extraordinary list, Maynard Keynes, etc., of people they dragged in to be the sponsors in the build-up to it. If we move on. It was very well, so there was an exhibition which accompanied it, painters, and move on again. And very canny build-up. So here was selecting the selection group for the surrealist room with them. There was an abstract room, surrealist floor, etc. So here we have Roland Penrose, Paul Nash, and Henry Moore, and a woman who I haven't been able to identify, forming the selection committee for the surrealist work. And they used pre-publicity fantastically. The press book is vast of the press cuttings and they, Jacob Epstein, Duncan Grant, Mike Calfer, Mahaly Naga, Paul Nash, writing to the Yorkshire Observer. It was like all over the place. They were writing. The Daily Herald building it up, but they had, if we move on, the right-wing press loved it. So Red Gallery of Art Horrors insulting Union Jack. Now, could happen anytime, couldn't it? But and Red Artist Propaganda Foil. What happened was the Duke of Westminster, who was a nasty piece of work, he became increasingly fascistic as the richest man in England as the 30s progressed. Who was the ground landlord, sent his agents round, found peace propaganda in the exhibition and said, you can't have your Congress here. Now, the terms of the lease, I think, was such that he couldn't actually evict the exhibition because that was specified, but he could enforce something saying you can't have other meetings, etc., etc. So they had to suddenly rearrange it and take it to Conway Hall, if we move on. And so you can see the overprinting there. If we move on again, here's James Boswell at that Congress meeting at Conway Hall, and we move on again. And Jack Hastings there, contemplating trying to find his chin, but obviously thinking about something very, very serious. James Holland, Claire Leighton in the middle, and then James Holland is similarly contemplative. On the right-hand side, we have James Fitton, Margaret Fitton, Elizabeth Watson, who was Felicia Brown's great friend, and a woman called Nan Youngman, who was Betty Reed's partner for many, many years, and a superb organiser in herself. We move on again. And here we have on the platform Herbert Reed, W.G. Constable, who's working left to right, who was the first founding director of the Courtauld Art Institute, Misha Black, Jack Hastings, Quentin Bell delivering the report from the Education Commission, and Ronald Kidd, who was the founder of the National Council of Civil Liberties. And so they did bring, this was a Congress that began to exert pressure on public policy. But the difference was the American artists, the Second American Artists Congress, you look at the participants there, Picasso by direct wire, but Mayor LaGuardia, Republican John Coffey on the Federal Arts Bill, this artist organization had got to a point of trade union strength that it was, even when the federal program was so contentious, it was able to behave like a politicized trade union body and have purchase in the sort of networks of public policy. The British state, despite the sun never setting on its empire, generated zilch demand for artistic and cultural work in the 1930s. It was only with the coming of the Arts Councils began to portraits of Spain, Spanish medical aid. If we move on, Jack Hastings was instrumental in this. This was something that raised from the summer of 1938 significant money to refurbish and resupply the artist ambulance that had been sent out. All these artists agreed to do works, the fee for their normal fee, the fee going to Spanish medical aid. If we go back, just on that, the largest one was they raised 580 quid by December of that year, equivalent to £42,000 in today's money. And then there's a letter I came across the other day from the son of the head of Cadbury's saying, here's a cheque for 500 guineas, which was the portrait to be done by Augustus John. Will arrange for my father to sit in due course, but because of the urgency of what's going on in Spain, the family don't want any publicity, but you better have the money now. So that was another £42,000. This was the time of the food ships campaign, so the Republic beginning to collapse. In December and January, there was a great focus, and Stepney Trades Council had a £1 million campaign to send a food ship out for winter supplies. So if we move on, Revelius did one at under the scheme, Gavin Henderson's place. At the back, Jack Hastings had done a whole lot of frescoes about Gavin Henderson and his role in the local Labour Party and various other things he was doing. If we move on, there was actually a Basque children's camp there while he was doing this very nice country house painting at the back, but with the children at the back. Moving on, if we could just move on. Oh, this is one that's upside down. Jack Hastings became the guarantor of the tour of Guernica with Roland Penrose. So on the afternoon that the evening that Chamberlain stepped out at Northolt or wherever it was, Heston, and said, "Peace for our time." A little known but curious fact, Guernica was arriving at Tilbury from Paris on the beginning of its tour, which went to Burlington Galleries and then went to Whitechapel, where Attlee opened it. And there was another showing there as part of the campaign. So Jack Hastings, very instrumental in this. He'd moved away from doing murals, not having the opportunities to move on. This was an exhibition famously owned by the artist in the street. Lots of stories about that, which I won't tell. Because, and here, recently, one of the great discoveries in the collection of Maurice Kesselman, unpublished, uncatalogued papers, which have come to the Tate Archives, has come, so the AI lost most of its records during the Blitz, its core records, so you have to reassemble the story from other people's papers and other sources. But in Maurice Kesselman's papers has turned up a minute book of 60 meetings of the AIA Central Committee between Munich and Operation Barbarossa. It is absolutely fascinating, the detail about who was doing what. I just put one page up. So this is the beginning of a meeting on December the 13th, 1938. A letter about an Italian tour by Sadler's Wells, you know, people that are brilliant. Gabriel, who was a cartoonist, there was an editor imprisoned in Luxembourg for publishing a caricature of Hitler. Other men, hospitality, the Betty Ree and the Artist Refugee Committee. So Jack Hastings was very involved in that after the Sudetenland, and lots of artists coming from Prague to London. They set up the Artist Refugee Committee, blah, blah, blah. 6, donation from Lord Hastings. This was a guy who used his family wealth to support lots of good things in the 1930s, and that's quite a recurrent thing. So Jack Hastings, he had moved away. He'd split up with Christina, who was very much in the CP, was, I think, at one point treasurer, co-treasurer here. I think the show trials and an experience he had on the way back from Spain, where he overheard Comintern minders being very pleased at the wool being pulled over the eyes of the English delegation through a hotel wall in Paris. He heard it, thin bedroom walls. There were various things that rang alarm bells for him. He ended up going down the Labour route. He wasn't, the AIA took up murals as a result of this in a big way. In the middle of the war, there was a massive effort. A man called Richard Carline with Keynes and people pulled together this big committee coming out of the experience of artists doing murals in the British restaurants, the temporary restaurants. They wanted to have a massive programme post-war in public buildings. I think its most substantial manifestation was the emphasis put on murals at the Festival of Britain in '51. Jack was not involved in that, nor was Clifford Wight. They did do a bit of teaching about fresco at Camberwell, the Central School, sort of almost sessional teaching, I think, and the Royal College of Art. During the war, he was part of the Home Guard and stuff like that. He had succeeded to the title. He was the 16th Earl of Huntingdon by now. Warner had fallen off his horse. So he was in the Lords. There was speculation he would be the first CP member of the House of Lords. Actually, he joined the Labour benches. He became a minister in the Attlee government for 5 years and continued throughout the rest of his life. He died in the early 90s. He supported, big supporter and campaigner for Indian independence, for the decriminalisation of homosexuality, for the abolition of the death penalty. He was a supporter of CND. So he went a radical progressive route, but not close to the Communist Party. But anyway, I've gone on far too long. I'm sorry. Thank you for being very patient.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. We did say we'd wrap up at 8:30. I know it is literally 8:30. If anyone has any pressing questions, I don't know whether you want to.
I'm fine. I'm sorry to
Andy afterwards, whatever. But thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone agrees, and I'm definitely going to come along to the Tate Britain for this exhibition.
Yes, there will be a display about the AI in the Tate Britain Archive Gallery, which is a smaller space in Tate Britain. There's room for about 20 works. We'll have 20 works that were in AIA exhibitions. There were crucial exhibitions, some of which I've referred to. The last one we will be covering is one called For Liberty, which was held on the bomb site of John Lewis in Oxford Street. Many famous artists, Kokoschka and so on, involved in it. It was just at that psychological moment in early 1943 when people thought we're going to win this. So it was looking forward to the post-war world as much as what are we fighting for, fighting against. And so we'll have works about that and a lot of the AI records and anecdotal stuff, about 250 items plus these 20 works. It'll be up for a year from the 24th of June next year. And then there will be another exhibition starting in Eastbourne about the Left Review artists and Cliff Rowe and so on in October 25.
Brilliant. There's just lots of enthusiasm in the chat. So no immediate questions. Lots of thanks. So thank you so much.
Okay. Well, if anybody wants to be in touch about any particular